guys, Ramon Goose from The Guitar Show here. We're going to be looking at the guitars of the founding member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones. Brian Jones was born in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire on 28th of February 1942. Growing up, he mainly listened to blues music, and his early influences included Elmore James and Robert Johnson. I'm going to quote you now Bob Dylan, who is telling a story about first meeting Mike Bloomfield in Chicago. He could play like Willie Brown or Charlie Patton, Dylan says. He could play like Robert Johnson way back then in the 60s. The only other guy who could do that in these days was Brian Jones, who played in the Rolling Stones. He could also do the same thing, finger-picking rhythms that hardly anyone could do. Those are the only two guys I've ever met who could, from back then, the only two guys who could play that pure style of country blues authentically. The instrument that Brian first played was a saxophone. Early on, Brian was very much influenced by the music of Cannonball Adderley, and this inspired his interest in jazz. 2 years later, on his 17th birthday, his parents bought him a cheap, nylon-strung Spanish guitar. On April the 7th, 1962, under the name Elmon Lewis, Brian was seen at the Ealing Jazz and Blues Club, playing Dust My Broom on a Hofner Committee electric guitar. Brian played slide guitar on this instrument, and it's quite possible that Brian was the first person ever in the UK to play slide guitar. Okay guys, I just want to go into this actual evening because it's quite an important event for the whole of rock and roll. So basically, Brian Jones was sitting in with a band called Blues Incorporated, and this was actually Alexis Cornet's own band that he put together with many great sort of rock and roll future stars such as Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. So on that particular evening, on the 7th of April, Brian was presented to the Ealing Club crowd by Alexis Cornet. And with his Hofner Committee guitar, he proceeded to play slide guitar on the Elmore James song, Dust My Broom. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were really impressed by Brian Jones's performance. So that's actually how the Rolling Stones was first formed, between Keith Richards, Mick Jagger and Brian Jones. On a side note, I've actually had the pleasure of performing at the Ealing Jazz and Blues Club. It's not actually a music venue anymore, but the Ealing Club Foundation actually do open it up sometimes for concerts. If you want to know all the information about the Ealing Club and when they run concerts, please go to ealingclub.com. Brian was next seen with a Harmony strata-tone. He used this at the Marquee Club with the Stones. This guitar was bought for £30 in 1959 by the Stones' original manager, Dick Hatterell. Hatterell states, Brian was brilliant on the acoustic guitar, but what he really wanted was an electric guitar. I knew he needed to further his career, so I offered to buy him a guitar. Brian almost snapped my arm off, and he knew exactly what he wanted. Brian's girlfriend at the time, Pat Andrews, also remembers seeing Brian with this guitar. She says, seeing Brian sat on our tatty sofa with Keith Richards cross-legged at his feet. He was teaching Keith how to play because Keith only knew 3 chords back then. The Harmony Stratotone was used on the first Rolling Stones hit, Come On. The guitar vanished in the early 1960s and remained missing until 2007, when the family of a dentist called Basil Wilson, who used to practice in Ealing, West London, said he had been given the instrument by one of the Stones' entourage. Okay, the next guitar is probably the guitar most synonymous with Brian. Here we can see Brian with a Vox Phantom Mark III prototype guitar. Tom Jennings, the man behind Vox Amplifiers, wanted to build a guitar line that would compete with American-made instruments. He turned to a British furniture builder for assistance and later set up an agreement with several Italian accordion and guitar manufacturers. The Jennings Company, or otherwise known as JMI, came out with 2 guitars under the MK series. These were loosely based on Fender instruments. These 2 instruments were commonly known as the Teardrop and the Phantom. In the beginning of 1964, Vox gave Brian an MK model and asked him to promote it. Brian's guitar was built in the Dartmouth British factory, and its shape is slightly different than the guitars made in Italy by the Echo Industries factory. Brian's guitar is slightly longer when compared to later models. The 6-on-a-side headstock was definitely influenced by Fender, and on the back of the guitar was a round protective snap-on pad, similar to those found on Gretsch guitars. An interesting thing about this guitar is it actually used a real Fender Stratocaster tremolo, and that included the saddles, the bridge plate and the block. Part of the bridge plate was actually sawn off to fit into the guitar, as you can see from this photo. The padding at the back of the guitar was most probably placed to hide the tremolo block and also the earthing wire. Brian used this guitar throughout 1964 and 1965. So listening to his recordings and the tone he achieved, I'm guessing that he had a low action and also thin strings. Brian played the lead lick to The Last Time on this guitar. So along with the Vox Teardrop guitar, Jennings presented Brian with a matching white prototype Vox Mark III electric 12-string guitar. Along with the first guitar that they gave Brian, that was also hand-built by Mick Bennett. The 12-string had two pickups, a Vox vibrato system, and a white 12-string style Vox headstock. The only footage of Brian playing the 12-string guitar was on Ready, Steady, Go, the television appearance on July 1964. Okay, the next guitar we're going to talk about is a 1963 Gretsch model G6118 anniversary model, which is a lime green colour. So Brian bought this guitar at Sound City, which was a music shop in London. Due to tax restrictions, in the early 60s, Gretsch instruments were more readily available than Gibson and Fender. That's because Gretsch's drumline was exported from the USA to Germany, and from there it was imported into Britain. Brian used this guitar on I Wanna Be Your Man, as well as the Rolling Stones' first album. It was also used on the Rolling Stones' first American tour in June 1964, and also at the recording sessions at Chess Studios in June of 1964. Before embarking on their fifth British tour, which began on September the 5th and ended on October the 11th, the group actually gathered at Regent Sound for another recording session, with Oldham producing and Bill Farley engineering. During the September the 2nd session, 3 songs were recorded: Howling Wolf's Little Red Rooster, The Drifters' Under the Boardwalk, and the new Jagger Richards original titled Off the Hook. This was the first session at which Keith used his 59 Les Paul. So in this session, Brian played a white Fender Telecaster, which was actually bought by Keith Richards. Beat Instrumental reported in the fall of 1964, Telecaster for Keith Richards. Bob Adams of Sound City reports that Keith Richards has bought a new Fender Telecaster, but he doesn't have any intention of getting rid of his Epiphone. Brian here is pictured in 1964 at the RCA sessions in Hollywood, 1965. So here you can see Brian in the recording studio with Keith Richards' Fender Telecaster. After finishing the sessions at Chess, the group flew to Los Angeles on May the 11th for another recording session at RCA. Before departing Chicago, the Stones actually landed an endorsement deal with Gibson. Gibson actually gave Keith and Brian 2 matching Sunburst Gibson Firebird 7s, which were at the time Gibson's top-of-the-line solid-body guitars. Brian used the Firebird 7 when the Stones played Satisfaction on the Ed Sullivan Show. In September 1965, he flew to Los Angeles for a scheduled recording session at RCA Studios, and he brought with him a Rickenbacker 1993 model electric 12-string. However, this was actually stolen towards the end of the 4th US tour, and he replaced it with a new Rickenbacker 360-12. Now, personally, I don't think he actually used it in the studio much, although this here is a photo of him in the studio with the Rickenbacker. I think he tended to use this more of a live guitar. It's worth noting that the 1993 model Rickenbacker was actually called the Rose Morris 1993 Export Model 12-string. And the interesting thing about this guitar is it actually has an F-hole rather than the normal sort of Rickenbacker sound hole. It also has dotted fretboard inlays. The next guitar is a Gibson Firebird Gnome reverse model. Brian actually played this guitar from around April 1966 until 1968. Brian appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in September 1966. The model featured an ebony fretboard, dot inlays, mahogany body, tunematic bridge, Lyle vibrato tailpiece, 2 volumes, 2 tone knobs, and a 3-way selector switch. Some of these models featured 3 P90s, but this model actually had the 3 mini humbucking pickups. Brian used this on the US Stones tour in the summer of 1966 and at the Royal Albert Hall in the same year. Brian can also be seen using the non-reverse Firebird in early 1967 on various TV shows and also later in a European tour. There's a really nice performance by Brian playing this guitar on the Rock and Roll Circus. He plays it on the track No Expectations, so he probably actually had this guitar set up just for slide. One of the last guitars Brian played was a 1968 Gibson Les Paul standard guitar. It was actually a gold top with P90s, and you can see him using this new guitar on December 1968 at the Rock and Roll Circus show that the Rolling Stones never actually released at the time. It was used on songs Jumpin' Jack Flash, Parachute Woman, and You Can't Always Get What You Want. Throughout his career, Brian used an assortment of acoustic guitars. And here is a photo of Brian playing Symphony for the Devil on a Gibson J600 in June 1968. Okay, lastly, we're going to mention this particular guitar, which is a Gibson ES 330 TD electric guitar. This was actually bought by Keith Richards during their March 1967 European tour. But Brian actually mostly used this as Keith was still using his Gibson Les Paul Custom Black Beauty at the time. Okay guys, that's it for now. Just want to tell you we've got some amazing new videos coming up. A brand new series is just starting, and I'm going to be continuing doing the history of guitar greats. So please check back and do all the normal stuff like, share it, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. Okay amigos, hasta la vista. Take care.